I think so, but if you can't, yep, you're doing it.
Yep, awesome. All right. So just, I guess I'll introduce myself really quickly as well. Andrew Closter. I'm the Colorado field advocate with Earthworks, and I just started full-time in this position in January. But as many of you, it sounds like know, Earthworks has been pretty active in the Front Range with our OGI work for the last couple of years. So I have a slide show that I'm going to present and hopefully get through relatively quickly. I don't want to drone on forever, and I want to be respectful of everyone's evening, but I also want to give us a chance to people a chance to ask questions and for us to have a conversation. So I want to get through the slides, but if you do have questions while I'm going through, please feel free to interject and or put something in the chat, and Kate will flag it for me because it is sometimes easy to not talk for 20 minutes straight. But I also plan on and hope to get through the slides so we can have a conversation at the end and I can answer questions, especially in regards to some of the CDPHE complaint forms that I'm going to walk through and that process, because I imagine that there may be questions about that. And I see you're just joining us, Giselle. Would you like to really quickly introduce yourself for everyone?
Hi, yeah, sorry I was late. I was getting back from a bike trip, so I'm glad I didn't miss the whole thing. My name is Giselle Hersfeld, and I'm the Boulder County Coordinator for 350. I'm also the Defund Climate Disaster Coordinator for 350, and thank you so much for holding this today. I'm really excited to learn more.
Awesome. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now. Can everyone see this? Awesome. All right. So as I said, we have been active in the Front Range and getting our OGI, doing our OGI field work in the Front Range for quite a while. Haven't been too really focused on Longmont too much in the last, I would say, couple of years, but on our most recent bout of field work, which we conducted between January 26th and 28th of this year, we did make sure to check out some sites in Longmont, particularly because of some of the spikes in methane and VOCs that have been recorded at the monitoring station on the Union Reservoir, which I'm sure many of you on this call are aware of at this point, but we decided it was a good opportunity to take a look at some sites we hadn't looked at in a while and to also potentially check out some new sites. Not with the intention of, I should just be clear right now up front, of really being able to determine and necessarily pinpoint where those emission spikes were coming from. That's very hard with any sort of air monitoring technology like that, but at least to see what we could see. And I think, I think we can be pretty safe in assuming that those spikes that were recorded are probably due to oil and gas activity. So that was why we were stopped in Longmont for 2 of our days while we were out. And just in case, it sounds like quite a few of you are quite familiar with our work and our OGI, but just in case there aren't, there's some people who aren't, I just want to give a brief little background of what we do and what we mean when we say field work. So when we say field work, it's our work with our FLIR camera, which are specially designed cameras. These cameras are the industry standard cameras that the operators, the regulators use to detect leaks. And because they capture optical gas imaging footage, which referred to shorthand as OGI. And as our tagline at the top of the slide suggests, this makes invisible gas visible. So when we say invisible gas and we're talking about oil and gas facilities, that's typically hydrocarbons like methane, like VOCs, that this camera is able to detect. And as those kind of bullet points on the slide suggest, our ideal way of going about this, of going about our field work, is kind of partnering with local community members in the municipalities or the counties that we're working in or targeting to identify problem oil and gas sites, either because of odors that people are smelling or potential health impacts that people are experiencing, and or just concern over sites because of the phase of production they're in or because of their proximity to schools or homes or whatnot. But identify those sites and then you know, come out, film them. And if we do find emissions that are concerning or seem really significant, following up on those kind of with our footage by filing complaints with both the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And then just really quick, one last slide on kind of background, which again, it sounds like many of you have been kind of working in this field or involved in this field for quite a while. So this may all just be repeat for you, but why we're concerned about things like methane and volatile organic compounds. For methane in particular, its potential as a greenhouse gas. I mean, a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. Which obviously is, you know, not just the environmental concerns around that, but also the health impacts both in the short term and long term from climate change in the state of Colorado and nationally and internationally. And then with volatile organic compounds, the concerns I would say are much more direct in terms of impacts, potential health impacts for the people who reside around an oil and gas facility. And, you know, these compounds include things such as benzene and toluene, which are known carcinogens, have been linked to other potential health impacts, not good stuff whatsoever. And then just also for anyone who has had any experience with fracking sites, especially living nearby to a site, especially depending on the phase of production it's in, you're going to have a decreased quality of life from the noise, the odors, the lights, the truck traffic, the dust. These are pretty heavy industrialized operations, and having them next to homes is never really a good equation. And then I just always throw this sort of statistic in any of our presentations. This map comes from the Oil and Gas Threat Map, which is a website that all of you are free to visit. And it basically gives you a display of all of the active well sites in not just the state of Colorado, but any state in the country that you're interested in. And it's the proximity of people who live within a half-mile radius of these sites. And so I'll just say with this number, this over 250,000, that is based on 2010 census data. So I think especially in Colorado, with the population growth over the last 10 years, we can be pretty confident that that number is unfortunately, quite a bit higher than 250,000 Coloradans at the moment. So Longmont. So we, again, you know, kind of as I prefaced at the beginning, we decided to take a look mainly because of some of these spikes that have been occurring at the monitoring station on the Union Reservoir, and just look at a few sites, some of which we've visited before, some of which we haven't. And so on this map, you see displayed the pins represent the 8 sites that we looked at while we were visiting. The 3 pins that are in red are the 3 sites where we identified emissions that to us were concerning enough to file complaints with the COGCC and CDPHE. And so from north to south, those sites are the Cub Creek Hayley site is the furthest north one, so just north of Highway 66 there. The one that's right on the Union Reservoir is the PDC Energy Union site. And then the furthest south site that's in red is Extraction's Rind Valley site, which is just south of the city of Longmont and just south of the Sandstone Ranch. So the PDC Union site, this is the one, again, that's right on the Union Reservoir. And this is how I'll display all of if you've seen our work before, this is how we typically display our visuals, is with the digital camera photo, and then the OGI, it's the same angle taken at about the same time, just to provide this reference. And again, show, for those who aren't familiar, the fact that these emissions are completely invisible to the naked eye, but once we train the OGI camera on them, you see, so for instance, on this site, that middle stack there, quite a significant plume of emissions that are kind of coming off of it and then drifting out across the site. So I believe, if I'm oriented correctly, which I may be wrong because I'm not this great at that, I believe that those are drifting in a southerly direction or maybe southwesterly. Don't take my word for that because, again, I don't, but I believe the reservoir is behind us when we're taking this photo and this OGI. So this is the first site. And then also, you know, just again, in case people aren't familiar with the FLIR camera and the OGI, So this will display these hydrocarbons like methane and VOCs. This obviously doesn't give us any sort of indication as to the composition, the mix that we're seeing. It just displays for us the emissions that are coming off of these sites. So this is the one that was furthest south on the map, so just south of Sandstone Ranch. This is the extraction Rind Valley site. And actually, this is a tank. So this isn't even the well pad itself. This is a pretty large site with a bunch of different wells on it. This was a tank that was set a little bit off from the well pad. But as you can see in the OGI, I think this one is the clearest example of just how far these plumes of emissions can drift off site and carry into surrounding areas. And so the direction that this plume is drifting out across this farm field and towards a series of homes and other residential areas that are kind of in this more rural area. And this site I'll mention, and I have a link at on the slide here, and I'm gonna make these slides available to everyone after this presentation, so you can all reference them and follow these links. I'm not gonna waste our time by going to this YouTube link, but we filmed this site a couple of times in the past, and I think this July 2019 one was one in which we filed a complaint. That footage, we filed a complaint based on the footage from July 2019. So this is a repeat offender, as unfortunately many extraction sites seem to be. And then the last one of the 8 that we filmed on this last round of field trip, again, this is the furthest north one, the one just north of Highway 66, this Cub Creek pad, the Hayley Pad. This is another one that we filmed a couple of times in the past, and we filed at least one other complaint on earlier in 2020. And again, that video is there, and you are free to follow that link and watch that video after the presentation when I provide the slides. And this one is similar to the PDC Energy Union site. These emissions aren't coming from a storage tank, but are coming instead from these combusted sources from at least 1 or 2 of the stacks on the left, and then the stack on the engine in the middle. And again, this GIF doesn't kind of pan across the landscape, but you can kind of see how the emissions are drifting off site. They don't stay on site. And this area too has seen, seems to have quite a bit of residential development going in, and there's more, there's a number of sites kind of like this that are pocketed throughout this area just north of that Highway 66. So it's always concerning to us when we're finding emissions like this coming off of sites and there are, brand new homes going in nearby, just because of, again, the impacts that this can have on people's health. And I should also mention too, because all three of these GIFs that I've shown are in a slightly different color palette. That doesn't mean anything in terms of what the camera's picking up. We can just, when we're filming, we can choose kind of the frame or the lens to use, the palette to use. And just some are better at displaying what we're seeing than others, but it doesn't indicate anything different in terms of what's being visualized. And then these are not from Longmont, but I, just like to include kind of other OGI, especially if people don't have as much experience looking at our footage of other sites. And so these were also from our round of field trip in January, both the top one in Windsor, and you can't really see where those plumes of emissions are coming from, but it's some smaller flare stacks behind this larger combustor behind that earthen berm. And then this site on the bottom is another PDC site in Platteville, the Platteville area, which again, you can see the emissions coming off of these stacks. And so that's all I have for visuals. And so before I transition into talking a little bit about the complaint process and walking you through the CDPHE complaint forms, I want to take a moment if anyone has any questions or if there's anything in the chat or anyone wants any clarification on anything.
There was a couple things in the chat. A question about the last 2 slides were showing flaring.
1 second.
Right.
So the Cub Creek site?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's these, when we're seeing emissions from flares like this, it can be, so sometimes, when we file these sorts of complaints, I feel like the typical response from operators is that this is just how things are supposed to be operating normally. I don't really buy that necessarily. I mean, yes, there are going to probably be emissions from these combusted sources, because that's kind of the point, is they're combusting on site. But to have that much emission coming off, those much emissions coming off of it and then drifting off site, I would say is a problematic thing. And when we see this sort of thing is usually when we decide to file a complaint on it. It may not necessarily be the indication of like an improper flare or a dirty flare, but it's definitely a sign that more emissions are coming off of it than you would expect or should be expected.
And there are several questions in the chat. One is, what percentage of the emissions are attributable to venting, flaring, or leaks? Like, how would you divide up the?
Oh, that's a good question. It really depends on. I mean, I think a lot of the emissions we see are from kind of combusted sources, flare stacks like this, that may or may not be functioning like they should be. Like I said, the operators typically, if our complaints get basically forwarded onto the operators, they're going to claim that this is an efficient operation. It doesn't look like that to me, but that's what the claim is going to be. But it really depends on the source. If it's coming from a tank or something, then it's potentially a venting issue, or it could be that the thief hatch or one of the hatches, or there's a faulty equipment that's not sealed properly. I would say, I don't really know if I have a good answer in terms of the amount or like percentage of each that we find. I mean, it's a pretty good mix, I would say, honestly, every time we go out, in terms of finding emissions from flare stacks, finding emissions from storage tanks that are potentially venting or have broken seals, and finding emissions from, I mean, we find emissions from really sometimes very random pieces of the infrastructure on these sites as well, because there's just typically so much on a site that, where any potential faulty piece of equipment could potentially lead to emissions.
There's another question. Are these all completed fracking wells?
All of these, yes. None of these are in a pre-production or early production phase. All of these are established well sites.
And Mike had a question, which we kind of answered, but it says you can't identify what emissions are coming out, but what's the industry's typical explanation about what's coming out? And you said it's normal, but what is that normal?
Yeah, I mean, well, they will claim, I mean, again, it's if we get really lucky and find something that is very obviously a leak from a piece of faulty equipment, and that can be hard because when we're filming, we try very hard to stay offsite. We don't trespass, give them no reason to sort of come at us for a different reason than what we're filming. It can be hard for us to detect with the OGI camera where exactly the emission source is coming from, where the source is. So if it's if we get lucky and it's very obviously a leak or a piece of faulty equipment, they have less kind of wiggle room to come up with their own framing. But when it's a shot that's further away, or when it's, again, kind of these combusted sources like this, they just usually they'll give us a canned response, or they'll give the CDPHE, who then forwards it on to us, a canned response that this is how this equipment is supposed to be operating. This is normal operations, which, in the case of something like this, if that's true, then the normal operations are still problematic because those emissions are carrying off site, and any homes that are nearby are going to be impacted by that. So, regardless of whether or not it's normal or acceptable, there still is an underlying issue here that it shouldn't be.
There's a couple more questions in the chat. When a complaint is made, if the operators can simply claim their operations efficient, what more can one do to hold the operator accountable?
Well, I'll get to that when I talk a little bit more about the complaint process. That's actually that's a good segue. So if the others are about complaints, we can get into that, or if there's
no, I think there's another one. And if I've missed anything, please shout it out. This one says, when you say flare stacks, are you referring to actual flares or enclosed combustion devices?
Sorry, was there another?
Oh, it's just because it's worth clarifying.
Yeah, so these are enclosed combustion devices. These aren't, it's still a combusted source. You just can't see the combustion occurring like you could on I think when we typically think of a flare, we think of something where we can see the open flame. And that's not as typical anymore for most of these sites. They have these closed combustion sources, but that's what's going on in these stacks. is there combusting the emissions on site or combusting the excess gas on site.
Jana said, calling them flares may be confusing since flaring is no longer allowed.
Yeah, no, sorry. That's, again, it's no longer allowed. But these combusted sources, these stacks on these sites that, like I said, they're basically, they're not enclosed flares technically, but the principle is somewhat similar. It's just not as dirty as a typical flare would be, or as I guess like a prior, the open flame.
I feel like it still kind of looks like a flare though. Like I've heard about people seeing flaring at the Union's reservoir site, but maybe that's not what they're seeing.
Well, the fact that flaring is no longer allowed doesn't mean that it doesn't go on. And that's the point. Andrew, can I ask one last question?
Yeah, sure.
I got here late, sorry. So I didn't hear your opening remarks, but did you guys just select a few sites at random and this is what you found, or you suspected there were some violations and went to those?
So I mean, a few of these sites people had asked us to look at, and then a few were just revisits of sites that we'd been to in the past. And then a few we just, as we were driving around, we stopped and took a look. The reason that we targeted Longmont in particular in this area sort of around Union Reservoir was because of some of the spikes in methane and VOCs that the air monitoring equipment on the reservoir has picked up in the last couple of months. And we didn't hope to necessarily pinpoint a source for that because those spikes were really brief and kind of intermittent. But we just wanted to see what we could see what we could contribute in terms of visuals to this issue, because it's likely that those spikes at the monitoring station were from oil and gas activity. I mean, obviously with these sorts of things, especially with our OGI, we're usually reacting after the fact. So, and a lot of these emissions events, especially major emissions events, can be very intermittent or based on kind of what's going on at the site. If they're doing maintenance or if they're doing some sort of other thing that's going to lead to more emissions, it could lead to like a dramatic spike, but we're not obviously going to catch it unless we're right there. So that was the impetus, was to just kind of like take a look at some of these sites, given the monitoring that's been going on. So are we good to move on to, all right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this before we kind of, conclude this, and we can open it up to more of a broad conversation as well. One of the other, so I wanted to definitely give an update on kind of what we saw, what we didn't see. And just so you're all aware as well, I don't think I mentioned this yet, we are going to be back out in the field this week, and we plan on revisiting some of these sites as well. And if there's any other sites that we didn't hit that you potentially would like us to take a look at and we have time to take a look at, please, let me know after the presentation, we can talk and we can add that to our list, hopefully, or our itinerary. But I also wanted to do this. Me and Kate talked about kind of organizing this on the second part of this is because, as I mentioned, we filed the complaints with COGCC and CDPHE. And our response rate is a bit mixed in terms of both responsiveness and in terms of the actual sort of complaint process that plays out, whether or not the investigators at the CDPHE, for instance, really mount an investigation, or if they just forward our visuals and footage onto the operators and kind of let the operators speak for themselves. One thing we've noticed, however, is that we've started to enlist community members more in kind of following up on our complaints with their own complaints on the same site, especially if they live nearby, especially if they felt impacted by it. And that has led to, I don't want to, the verdict is still a little, I don't think the verdict is in yet. The jury's still out, but I think we've noticed that helps compel our state regulatory agencies to take some of these problem sites a little bit more seriously if there's residents or community members who are corroborating the evidence that Earthworks is finding. So this isn't to put pressure on all of you to suddenly start filling out a bunch of complaints and going through this process if you don't feel comfortable doing it. But I do want to provide a quick walkthrough of this complaint process, so you are all aware of these tools that exist, which as I'll explain, are definitely far from perfect. But you're at least all aware of it, and so you can take advantage of it. And if, for instance, on our next round of field work, if we come back and we've found more emissions at these same sites or other sites, and you feel compelled to file complaints of your own, I would more than welcome that. And I would love to work with any of you or all of you to do that. I think this is a good way of, we do this to hold our regulators, the COGCC and CDPHE accountable to their mandate to protect our health and our environment, and to hold the operators accountable. And I think the more community pressure that we have in terms of people knowing how these tools work and knowing when and when not to use these tools can only help. So really quickly, I'm not going to follow all of these links and show you all of this because I don't want to take up all that time. And again, I will provide all these slides. So all of these links are available to you. The COGCC and the CDPHE, two separate agencies, they have separate complaint tools for residents, the public to use. I'm not going to go through the COGCC one as much. And that's in part because for us and our purposes, when we're talking about air emissions, or if you're talking about health impacts, it's not really the place where you would submit a complaint. We submit complaints in both places simply because the COGCC actually has a complaint search tool. They assign each complaint a unique identifier. You can search for the complaints. You can search for complaints by site, by operator. That is not a functionality that the CDPHE provides. So we file it as a way of kind of keeping some sort of a public sort of transparency, accountability for our complaints. But ultimately, all of the complaints we file with COGCC that are air emissions related, which are basically all the complaints we file, get just forwarded on to the CDPHE, because ultimately they are the agency that is responsible for air emissions and air quality in the state of Colorado. So I will really quickly follow these links to these forms just to show you all what these forms look like. But the CDPHE has two separate forms, and depending on your sort of exposure to oil and gas and you're interested in working through this process, one of these forms may apply to you. So the health complaint form, which I think I should be able to do this without screwing too much up. And again, you'll get all these slides so you can follow these links and look at these forms yourself and kind of. But I just want to provide a quick walkthrough. This form is obviously if you have a health concern about an oil and gas site, whether it's one of the sites I've talked about today or just any site in general. If you live near a site or know someone who lives near a site, this is the form that you would fill out to notify the CDPHE of your concerns. So, starts with contact information, and just to be, you should be comfortable in sharing this information in the sense that none of this will be public. This is considered health data, so none of your contact info is going to be displayed in any way that the public can access. But provide your contact information, then talk a little bit about the exposure, the concern. So a lot of these are pre-filled, pre-select kind of things. You can identify whether or not your exposure is occurring at work or at home, at school, vacation, other. The source of concern is the well site or the sort of site that you're concerned about, oil and gas site, and they have a kind of a list here. If, all of the sites that as I mentioned, that I showed were well sites, but if you're not sure, if you don't know, because again, this infrastructure can be hopelessly complicated, even for people who work in this field, you can always select other, but then just give some kind of information about where the site is. That's what this is. So if your exposure is occurring at home, then you can use your home address. If it's occurring somewhere else, or if you've, recreated a place and notice a site that you feel concerned about or feel like is problematic, or you were potentially exposed to something there, you would try as best to identify. Obviously, a lot of these sites aren't going to have mailing addresses, but they should have signage, whether it's on the fence line or whether it's at the entrance to the site, that at least gives some name or number to identify this site. If it doesn't have signage, that's actually a reason to identify the COGCC or to notify the COGCC, because it should have signage. You should be able to identify what the site is called at the site. And then the form just asks for, your symptoms. And I will say, to CDPHE's credit, this is a pretty exhaustive list, not completely comprehensive, but there's a lot of things in here. So even beyond just kind of the physical sorts of impacts that I think are typically associated with health impacts from oil and gas, like headaches, nosebleeds, irritated eyes, throat, they have lack of energy, they have depression on here, they have anxiety, stress. So you don't have to feel, I guess, like pigeonholed, that you've had a very specific health impact from a site to potentially fill this form out. If you feel as if you're concerned about a site and you're concerned about its impact on your health, even if you don't know or you're uncertain whether or not you've been impacted, I would say you could still fill this form out. You're not going to be penalized in any way. This is a tool for the public to use. It's about notifying the CDPHE about what you're concerned about. And so after you select your symptom, and you can add multiple symptoms, as many as you want, you just give a little bit of information about kind of how often it occurs, when it began. And then you can provide whether or not you've talked to a physician about the symptoms you're experiencing or your concerns, and then add other family members to this form. So this is the health complaint form. And I'm going to show you the other form really quickly and get through a couple more slides, and then we can have a broader conversation in case there are questions, and I can always return to these forms. So the other form, much more, in my opinion, worthless. And this is the one that we're stuck using. So the non-health form, so if you don't have a specific health concern, or you don't feel like you don't feel comfortable filling out the health form, but you still want to potentially fill out a complaint about a site, this is the form that you have to use. So basically it allows you to select what your concern is, put in your contact information, and then submit the form. I guess in the hopes that someone will eventually follow up with you and ask for all of the relevant details that the form refuses to collect. So in this instance, and I would say too, even with the health complaint form, and I'm going to try to go back to a presentation view really quick. I've provided here on the slide, and you'll also find this, again, I can also send these links separately if that's easier for people. This email is the email that kind of governs the CDPHE's oil and gas health complaint process. If you fill out the non-health complaint form, it is almost absolutely essential that you immediately follow up with an email to this email address that gives some context as to what the site is that you're concerned about, because the form doesn't allow you to do that. And also just some narrative about your kind of concern in general, whether it's, if it's something that you've been concerned about for a while, whatever it is, adding some kind of texture and some of your voice to it. And I would say the same is true of the health complaint form, even though that's a little bit more of a comprehensive form. Following up with an email that gives a little bit of personal sort of narrative to the complaint, your concern, is helpful. And it's helpful for the CDPHE as well. And we've noticed when community members have done this, they really appreciate getting that kind of extra context. Because I think many of them will be the first to admit, staff at CDPHE, that their forms are not perfect. And no web form is ever going to be perfect at collecting the information that it needs to get, but they really do want to hear from community members, and they want community members to give them these their kind of experience. And so then this slide just kind of goes over some of the things I've already said. When to use the CDPHE form versus the COGCC form. If you, obviously for CDPHE, the health impacts, if you're experiencing any health impacts or concerned, use their form. If you smell odors, because that's an air emissions issue, use their form. And if you do see emissions from a site, for instance, black emissions from one of those stacks, or from again, the flaring is via the rulemaking now not allowed in the state of Colorado, but that doesn't mean that you still may not at some point witness a dirty or inefficient flare. And if you do, you should definitely notify CDPHE. For the COGCC side of things, I know I didn't look at that form, but there are some instances where you would want to potentially use that one. And that's, for anything operational at the site, especially depending on the phase of production, if you're concerned about or have issues with excessive sorts of noise, lights, traffic, dust, that's a place where you could use the COGCC form. Especially if you see spills or leaks or anything on the surface of the site that's not air emissions related, definitely use the COGCC form and bring that to their attention. And again, if the site lacks signage or is poorly maintained, or, the fence line's falling over, you just notice something about the site that, you find problematic, then you can use the COGCC form. And if you're, concerned about tracking your complaint like us, and you feel free to also file in both places as well. Just know that if it's air emissions or health related, they're going to forward that on to the CDPHE. And then really quickly before we wrap up, just to be completely, just to give you all a quick sort of overview of what we've found for the last couple of years while we're filing complaints. And I've already talked a little bit about this based on some of the questions that have been asked. But, we filed 82 complaints in total since 2018 in the Front Range, and well, a few in the Western Slope, mostly in the Front Range, but in the state of Colorado. Of those 82, this site right here pictured in Platteville, the Aka Energy Spear Gas Plant, is the only one of those 82 complaints that's ever led to a fine or a penalty for what we found. And this, going back to that leak question, this is one where we did specifically, we're able to capture a piece of equipment that was leaking. And so the CDPHE did fine the operator $57,000 for the excess emissions. And then after that period, in 2019, this same site was granted 2 applications to expand their pollution, their emissions. And we've been back multiple times and have filmed many times over many emissions, as you can see from the OGI, just pouring off of the site. So while it's good that we were able to detect that leak and that specific leak was fixed and they were fined, we still, as we return time and again, continue to find these emissions that are, very, very concerning. So, in our mind, while I don't want to discourage you from using these tools and, bringing these sites to the CDPHE and COGCC's attention, because again, these are the tools we have available to us. But at the same time, I want you to all be very aware of the fact that at the present moment, the way that our enforcement system works in the state is just not working for us, not working to protect our health and not working to protect the environment. And then this table really quickly just goes through sort of the results of our complaint process. Again, this is the 8 submitted are ones that we're still waiting to hear back on. The closed, no action taken is exactly what no action was taken at all. 51 that were closed with when we say other regulatory action, that's our shorthand for probably what happened was the investigator just forwarded on our visuals to the operator, as I mentioned. And then the operator, basically just came back with the response that operations were normal or nothing was allowed. Very infrequently does an investigator from the CDPHE actually go and look at the site in question. It does happen, but not as often as we'd like. And then the only 9 of our 82 complaints have ever resulted in any sort of action, whether it's fixing a leak or other action to reduce the pollution that we have identified. And so, as I kind of said, the main takeaway is that our enforcement system is just not working. And, again, this is not to discourage you from potentially using these tools. And as I was kind of saying, we've noticed from we've just kind of started to do this more frequently, and we've noticed that there is much more responsiveness from CDPHE and COGCC when we're kind of combining our complaint process with citizens also filling out complaints. So those are steps in the right direction. Those are steps towards them being more accountable and responsive. I mean, we are still kind of going to have to wait and see what the follow-up looks like and the follow-through, but we just have to keep pressure. I mean, this is what we do at Earthworks. This is what I'm hoping you all can help us with and, feel empowered to do. I mean, we need to continue to keep pressure on the COGCC and CDPHE to do their jobs, because as much as it's wonderful that we've gotten a lot of these new rules passed in the last year, they're only as good as the enforcement. They're only as good as much as they're enforced. And so we need to keep the pressure on them to hold the operators accountable. And with that, I am going to stop sharing. And
there's a couple questions in the chat too. Karen asked, how did the CDPHE respond? But you covered that in the last part. Sounds like same as Pennsylvania, where they're just ignoring them. Ron asked, for downwinders, is it at all effective to file non-health complaints about general anxieties and concerns that emissions impact those respiratory issues like COPD and asthma, since the impact is well beyond Longmont or wherever any fracking operation might be located?
I mean, it's that in that sort of a situation, if you don't have a specific site that you're concerned about, I mean, I don't know how much, how useful it is specifically to, a regulator like the CDPHE, because they won't have a site to follow up with if they decide to follow up on a site. I mean, it's really up to you in terms of I don't think it's a bad thing to continue to use these tools and to continue to hold them accountable, regardless of whether or not you have a specific site that you're concerned about. I think they need to hear from all of us about our concerns. And, you know, if you're comfortable filling out the form, if it doesn't take too much time, then I would say go for it. It can't hurt. Again, you're not going to be penalized. These are tools that they've provided to us, as imperfect as they are, to, you know, hold them accountable, and to, you know, kind of be on the ground watchdogs for what's going on. And you should feel free to use them.
I have a question about another reason why it might be useful. I'm not sure about the answer, and it might be also for Mike Foote, or anybody else with a legal background. Even though when you fill out the health records, your personal information isn't part of the public record, like, would it be beneficial just to pile it on so that if, you know, if there's an accident at one of these sites or something like that, there's a huge public record of complaints that they didn't address? You know what I mean? Like in that sort of situation too.
Well, and I should have mentioned too, I didn't include a link in there, but I can provide it afterwards to everyone who's, so the CDPHE doesn't have like a complaint search tool, but for the health complaints, they do have a dashboard that basically has a map, and it tells you the zip codes of health related or non-health related complaints. So that's as granular as it gets. It doesn't really identify specific sites or anything like that, but at least to the zip code level, you can see, you know, in this month, if there was a spike in health related concerns, which, you know, isn't the most helpful. I think they're kind of hesitant because of the health data involved to get any more granular than that. But like, for instance, if it's Weld County with complaints, it's hard to know, you know, we have a lot of large counties in the Front Range, and there's a lot of oil and gas development. So, you know, if it doesn't, but that does exist to a certain degree. You can do some kind of investigation of where health related complaints are being filed, at least based on zip code. It's not the best form, but that's as public as that data, as far as I know, gets from the CDPHE.
There's a couple more questions. Don't counties also have complaint processes?
Yeah, and so do municipalities as well. I mean, it really just depends on the county or municipality, but, you know, Broomfield has complaint processes, and I think Erie does as well, and I think some counties do as well. So, you know, I focused on the CDPHE and COGCC in this because those are the ones we are typically filing with. But yeah, depending on where you live, there may be also local sorts of complaint processes that you can go through.
There's a couple things in the chat, and then I see that Michael Belmont also has his hand up. Karen put in the links where you can follow the air monitoring, and Mike Foote said there'll be an oil and gas emissions rulemaking at the AQCC later this year, where this information might be very helpful, and it's always best to file complaints. So this might be really good timing if we're piling it on for the rulemakings later on this year. And Michael has his hand up.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
A couple of things. I was curious, and this is a secondary question, but I was curious, when you file a complaint and you have emissions video, as you all have been meticulously taking, how do you include the video with the footage or convey that to COGCC and CDPH? But more importantly, I wanted to ask, what do these cameras cost? Because it seems to me there are very few of you. And if a local community could come together, purchase at least one camera, and have a couple of dedicated people that could regularly go out and film, since the COGCC doesn't seem to give a flip about these real complaints based on your stats about how much they've really responded in terms of site examinations and just following through, at least if you have this kind of footage, your local government, you could get their attention and pressure them to pressure the legislature, in a larger way, or at least act in the community based on SB 181 to be much more stringent and take much more bold action to minimize fracking activity. So could we get a camera? Probably. We could buy one. They're probably expensive, but could we acquire the training for a layperson or two to learn how to operate those and do consistent readings?
Yeah, so on the camera front, they are very expensive, as you mentioned. I believe the cameras that we use were around or over $100,000 for Earthworks to purchase a piece. So these are very, very expensive pieces of equipment. And you would definitely want to have trained people using them just to, again, because of the expense going in, the upfront expense, you want to make sure you're properly taking care of the camera, but you also want to make sure that people are properly understanding what they're seeing and what they're visualizing. But people are free. I mean, these are the FLIR's cameras are available for people to purchase. I mean, obviously the general public isn't out purchasing these things because of the expense and the operating sort of hurdles. But, there are thermography classes you can take to become a trained thermographer. Those also cost money. I mean, all of this costs money, but it's not outside the realm of possibility for a local municipality to invest in this if they had the staff to kind of follow through with it. If they had the staff to train to use this to be somewhat of like a watchdog, again, kind of watching these sites and inspecting these sites, because it should just say it's not even just us that have limited capacity, it's the CDPHE as well. I mean, to their I was going to say to their credit, but really just one of the issues with them in terms of the complaint process, which I completely, understand, is that they themselves only have a limited number of staff who can do this sort of like follow-up investigation with their FLIR cameras or whatever they're using. And there are tens of thousands of active well sites in the state of Colorado. So they're really, really ridiculously outnumbered as well. I mean, that's just something I think we should all keep in mind when as much as I've talked about the failures of our enforcement system, those aren't necessarily a slight on any of the people, who are doing this work, so much as there's a lot of issues with funding. There's a lot of issues with capacity to go around.
I see Jane is raising her hand too.
Yeah, I was curious, when you are submitting the FLIR images to CDPHE, I guess, because they have these air permits where they are allowed to emit, it's like in tonnages, the emissions that they are allowed. So is there something visually that they say, okay, this looks like too much, or are they giving you that excuse that like, hey, they're allowed to emit a certain amount, this video doesn't tell us anything?
Yeah, I mean, it varies. I mean, I think that's usually the response, is they're allowed to, because obviously we can't tell the composition or how much is being emitted just from the footage. Usually the response is, yes, this seems like it's operating normally and this is a permitted activity. I mean, obviously, if you're not really monitoring that, you can't tell exactly. But I think, again, it really depends on if our footage seems to be identifying something that's really off base or really coming from a piece of equipment that they wouldn't expect, they tend to be a little bit more, scrutinize it a little bit more. And as I kind of have been mentioning, if like community members are also filing complaints on a site, I think they tend to, it's like probably it's a process of prioritization for them as well, given their capacity. So, I think, their ability to actually follow up on every complaint, and especially if it's just a combusted source that looks like, yeah, maybe the emissions are a little bit more than you'd expect, but we don't know if, unless we get somehow an air monitoring something out there, we're not going to be able to tell if that's within their permitted limits or not.
Yeah. And we hope in Longmont that it is helpful, to be doing the air monitoring that's very detailed, and when it's significant and measurable, that does seem to be getting some attention from COGCC and CDPHE. And I was glad to see that even Weld County is now getting on board. They've installed 3 air monitors. They're not like super research grade or anything, but kind of triangulating with them. When I have our data from Union, we might be able to help narrow down some of these sources, and because they're all outside of Longmont, so it's outside of my jurisdiction to try to enforce, but it might help kind of point finger a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, and then even follow up with more sort of, whether it's Earthworks or someone else with a camera, or so, following up to try to pinpoint, whether or not this is from some permitted activity, or if these emissions are something to really, really be concerned about, because no one, I definitely, more air monitoring regionally would help.
Yeah, and I was glad to see with the new COGCC rules that they are taking a look at, like, for example, the combustion devices. They're going to be coming out and looking at them a little bit more closely. They're going to see if their modeled emissions are actually correct, and hopefully getting towards that you know, are what they're estimating as emissions actually, is it correct? Because they've got air data they've got to sync that up with now if their models aren't jiving with all of that. So hopefully we're moving in the right direction, but I agree, it sounds like more communities are getting interested in the air quality monitoring game, and that's going to be a powerful move.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it would make our life a lot easier too, because again, it's what kind of convinced us to come and look at some of these sites again, because some of them had been sites we'd looked at before, but you know, those spikes in methane and VOC, there were plenty of people who were concerned about them for good reason. I mean, they're coming from somewhere, so. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
See that Erie's pushing for the air monitoring too.
Yeah, we are, Eric, we are going to be in Erie, hopefully tomorrow, looking at May J and some of the other sites. So we'll have more to share soon, hopefully, about what we find.
Yeah.
All right, well, if there's nothing else, yeah, definitely, Eric. We will, you know, whatever, once we have shareable visuals, especially if we find things that are really concerning, we will definitely share those with you and, you know, the community in Collier's Hill and whoever else may be interested. We want our visuals to have that impact and have people have the community members using them as much as possible. So, yeah, I will. I don't know if we have, because I'm assuming a lot of people may have joined via Facebook. I don't know if we have everyone's email addresses. I don't know what the best way for me to share the slides is with people.
Do you want to put them in the chat so
Yeah,
people
I can do that
think
real quick.
if they want them? Yeah, Ron, I was at May J Saturday too. It looks like a dollar store. Monterey Station, that's funny. But yeah, I'm gonna put my email in the chat too. So if anybody has follow-up questions or can't find the slides or anything like that, feel free to reach out.